Thank you very much for that. Yes, indeed, I will talk about infrastructures. I will follow from Bill's fantastic presentation and discuss a little bit of how infrastructures explain this. This, not this. Not this yet, not this, not this, not this. Let's see, where is it? Okay. Okay, there it is. Good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this happened and the role that infrastructures played in the emergence of automated markets in the last 30 to 40 years. There are a recent phenomenon. This is from the Financial Times from 2007, and it hailed the advent of millisecond trading, or something that we now associate to things such as high-frequency trading. And what I want to do is tell you the story of how this happened and where it came from, where automated trading emerged from. So the question that I'm addressing, in a sense, is why did markets automate? Why is it that they moved from being these places that occurred, or these things that occurred on a trading floor, a very social trading floor, to being essentially transactions that take place on servers in these inconspicuous locations across the world? Now, of course, there's explanations of how this happened, and they tend to be economic explanations. So, for instance, the classical explanation is that automation was a product of economics. It made sense, of course, to automate stock exchanges and other organizations because automating things is cheaper. That's the traditional explanation. Of course, when you look into the history of specific organizations, such as the New York Stock Exchange, Amex, the London Stock Exchange, and so forth, you see that these explanations sort of fail because they don't really make sense of market organizations. They don't realize that the marketplace and transactions occur in these very rich environments and very complex organizational environments where interests aren't necessarily aligned towards reducing costs. So think of the New York Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, any stock exchange you want. They transformed radically. They went from being these very rich places where people would have conversations on a trading floor, where market makers would hold tremendous power over how the market was conducted, to being, again, essentially software factories, software firms. So a lot of the traditional explanation assumes that these places had an interest in becoming public software companies rather than staying as these semi-monopolistic member-owned private clubs. There was actually a lot of opposition towards automation because people liked being a member-owned organization. A lot of this story, of course, has to do, as Bill sort of mentioned, with the development of very particular infrastructures in financial markets that created path dependencies, created routes that allowed automation to happen in particular ways. So what I want to tell you is a little bit about these stories of how automated financial markets were produced by the development of infrastructures within these market organizations. So in a sense, the question that I'm addressing from a sociological perspective, which is slightly different than the economic perspective, is not so much the question of why did markets automate, but rather who built the infrastructures that allowed automated finance to emerge, and why did they build them? If you peer into the organization, if you open up the modern stock exchange, what do you find historically in terms of the creation of infrastructures, the rise of algorithmic and high-frequency trading? Now, you would imagine, as much of the literature suggests, that this is something that occurred from the top of the organization, that management committees would meet to decide the fate of the infrastructures of finance. But actually, when you look into the stories of very specific organizations, you see that it's not the top of the organization, it's not the top of the stock exchange or the industry that necessarily dictates how things evolve, but it's this thing that I call the obscure and invisible organizational middleware. And that's, I think, something that matters for understanding finance, fintech, and the way, in general, financial markets evolve historically. What do I mean by this organizational middleware? I mean something that connects the top of the organization, the market, to the sort of more mundane operations of maintaining things, of keeping the market going. It's things like this, a guy in a van going around the city of London and fixing some of the price visualization systems offered by a particular stock exchange. It's someone in a basement dealing and tinkering with TV screens in order to fix them so that they display prices in a more efficient manner. These are not the top echelons of the organization. These are the invisible middle. It's the back office, the settlement room, the R&D lab, the pipes that keep finance, in a sense, working and the market running. So what I want to tell you, and what I want to show, is that from a sociological perspective, the automation of finance can be understood as this unexpected occurrence that came out of this invisible middleware in the market. It's then a story of how particular workers within stock exchanges, within the organizations of modern finance, captured their organizations, they captured exchanges, they revealed the infrastructures that they had produced to then convert the market into an electronic form. And I'm going to use a very specific case, which I've sort of explored quite a bit over the last couple of years, which has to do with this organization. If you've seen this photo, that's great. This organization is the London Stock Exchange back in the 1960s. It all took place on a trading floor located a couple of meters away from the Bank of England. The trading floor was the site of all activity, and something tremendously interesting happened in 1986. This trading floor disappeared. It was converted essentially into a bunch of electronic signals, and it heralded in that way the emergence of automated finance as we know it today. Now, how did this happen? How did this transformation at the London Stock Exchange occur? Well, it occurred through a three-pronged process. The first element of this process is something that we can think of as capturing, sort of like capturing in a military strategy a particular position in the battlefield. Though in this case, it was an invisible form of capture that had to do with the growth of an organizational middleware within the stock exchange. And it really goes back to the 1950s, when a lot of the exchange was very manual. It wasn't mechanized at all, but it was facing pressures from settlement that obligated the managers to introduce the first generation of computers into the organization. So back in the 1950s, the London Stock Exchange had about one IT staff, permanent IT staff, and held one building in the City of London. The core of the organization, of course, was the trading floor. As they tried to deal with settlement, this invisible thing that no one seems to talk about in public about markets as much as trading, the stock exchange had to incorporate technologists into the organization. So with the first mechanization of settlement back in the 1960s, they hired the first in-house technologists. So by then, you had about 10 members of the organization devoted to dealing with computers and technology, which found this vast space to colonize and to do things for. So this small group of relatively invisible workers, these relatively invisible infrastructural workers, started to develop things for the marketplace without the marketplace necessarily wanting these things in the first place. They developed, for instance, the first price visualization system in Europe that was quite effective at the time. It started to produce quite a few profits for the stock exchange, so they were allowed to grow considerably. By the 1970s, you had about 50 members in the IT staff that had produced a few very successful systems and that continued growing throughout the decade until they reached about 500 members of the organization. So you went in 2 decades from 1 to 500 IT staff within the stock exchange. By then, the stock exchange occupied 8 buildings in the City of London. And of course, this only continued to grow. By the 1980s, the London Stock Exchange was perhaps the largest IT operation in Europe. It had about 2,000 IT professionals working in redeveloping technologies for the market. And when deregulation reached the city in 1986, these 2,000 technologists were very well positioned to transform things. And lo and behold, after 1986, when Big Bang or the deregulation of the city happened, these technologists had managed to develop sufficient infrastructures that allow the trading floor to altogether disappear. And it's a fascinating story. The LSE invested millions in a new trading floor, thinking that they would need it after Big Bang, but 2 weeks after the date of Big Bang, the trading floor was deserted. So these technologists captured the organization. They became, in a sense, the core of the organization. But of course, capture comes at a huge risk, because while everything was nice and bonny, while the market was growing, they could expand their numbers, but the moment the market hit a crash or stumbled, they became a huge liability. And that moment was shortly after Big Bang in 1987, when global financial markets crashed. And at that point, the trading volumes in the London Stock Exchange were reduced considerably, and the cost of maintaining this complex infrastructure became too high. So that would seem to have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, because the amazing thing with infrastructures is that they are propelled by people who travel with knowledge about what they did. And in particular, 3 of the individuals involved in the automation of the London Stock Exchange decided to set up their own little company within the City of London. These 3 individuals, Peter Bennett, Michael Waller-Bridge, and Stephen Wilson, set out to create something that is called, or was called, TradePoint. And TradePoint was fascinating because it was the first exchange based entirely on an electronic limit order book in England. It's the exchange that, in a sense, allowed for automation to happen as we know it today. And they built this exchange on the basis of the trust that they had developed by constructing systems for the market. And it was an exchange that had a clear objective: to take down their former employer, the London Stock Exchange, by introducing something that was better, faster, more efficient, and cheaper for a new generation of market users. Of course, they didn't have the clout or the power of the London Stock Exchange, but they had the capacity or the ability to reveal the infrastructures of the market for investors. So what they did was something very cunning, in a sense. They set up a little play for investors in London. The exchange at the time, the exchange that they created, TradePoint, was based on commercially available technologies and was based a few blocks away from Covent Garden in London. It was based there because they wanted to make it different from the establishment in the city. Of course, the computers that they used were relatively small. They were about the size of this table, and no one at the time believed that a computer the size of that table could harness the power of the market, could deal with a market as complex as the market in London at the time. So what they did is they lied a little bit, and they put these fake cables and these fake tubes coming out of the computer room in order to convince investors that there was a mighty, super powerful machine back there. And when investors went into TradePoint to see how they were operating, they would see this, as they say, this fat cable that was coming out of the machine room, which was completely make-believe. And they would think that there was an awesome machine in that room that could handle all these trades and all these operations. And TradePoint was successful. It was successful, perhaps not commercially, but it was successful politically, because the threat of an electronic limit order book pushed the London Stock Exchange to introduce its own version at a much earlier date. They managed to convert, in a sense, both the London Stock Exchange and the community of traders in London to adopt a very new, very different technology. They tackled 3 particular groups. The first one was regulators. Regulators loved the idea of the electronic limit order book, and they were convinced that TradePoint and the people behind TradePoint would deliver something that was necessary. They also managed to recruit global investment banks that saw the London Stock Exchange's monopoly over trading in London as completely unnecessary and prohibitively expensive. And they also managed to find support amongst a new generation of algorithmic traders that at the time were looking for computers to plug in their systems to. And with these three different constituencies, TradePoint managed to transform finance dramatically. This is a few days after the introduction of TradePoint. The London Stock Exchange announced that they were introducing an electronic limit order book, which set the foundations for the forms of algorithmic trading that we understand today. All of the forms of algorithmic trading that we know of today require something like the electronic limit order book. So what does this story say? Where did automated finance come from? Did it come from traders? Did it come from the management of exchanges? Certainly, they played a key role. They allowed some of these systems to occur. They used these systems and using them allowed them to propagate. But it also came, and this is the important thing, from the middle of the organization, these invisible parts of finance that are the source of change, but also the sources of paths that are resistant and resilient over long periods of time that have to be accounted for and analyzed and understood in better ways. And that is really the story that I wanted to share with you. So thank you very much.